For more on the China-U.S. trade talks, in our Beijing studio, we have Zhang Jianping, who is the Director General of the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. Also in Beijing, Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean from the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. In Washington, D.C., we have Steve Pruitt, Managing Partner at U.S Partner. Earlier, he was with the U.S. House of Representatives working on the budget issue. In Washington, D.C., we're also joined by Jeff Moon, former Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for China. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen, as we are leading toward March the 1st. Many have been asking, should March the 1st be regarded as the day when you have a process of negotiation? How you look at different dates of the timeline. Mr. Moon.
Well, President Trump has said that March 1st is not a magical date. So it could be more of a check-in point. There's a possibility of a delay in terms of increasing tariffs. And I'm optimistic that there will be some kind of interim agreement reached on March the 1st. We have press reports today talking about how there are 6 memoranda addressing many of the major issues that are outstanding, including some issues that China didn't recognize were problems before, and then 10 action items that are more short-term action items that would address the trade deficit. So all of that is positive news, but we really need to see how comprehensive those discussions are. We need to see how tangible the measures they're talking about are, and we need to look at the time frames, whether this is near term or long term. They should be short term, I think, and then enforcement is the final issue I think they need to look at.
Right. Mr. Pruitt, may I ask you about that too? I mean, in a way, there is already a process of talk and communication underway. But when it comes to a very comprehensive discussion about one country plus another country's structures, economic structures, and also the areas in which the two economies could work together, and particularly if you want to have checks along the way, one would assume it is a very complicated process to put it down on paper. I want to have your thoughts, Mr. Pruitt. Go ahead.
I would say it's not as complicated if there is agreement as to what the content should be. That I think is probably still the largest hurdle yet to clear. I think it's significant, as Jeff just noted, about the 6 memorandum and the other working list details that are currently being discussed. That's certainly, from a staff perspective, makes it a lot easier to write this into an agreement. What I see unfolding, quite frankly, is March 1 certainly is not set in stone. If they have an agreement in principle, I suspect they will want to, even after March 1st, clean that up. But there's also the possibility, and I think the discussions about a meeting between President Xi and President Trump that would certainly lead itself and lend itself to a grand production for signing an agreement that moves U.S. China trade forward. So I kind of see that being more the scenario. March 1 is sort of the day that they agree in principle and then clean it up, and then we have a big Hollywood-style production agreement signing.
Interesting. Mr. Zhang here in Beijing, many of the things mentioned by our 2 American guests are reported only by American press, or shall we say, international media organizations headquartered in the United States, but not necessarily by the Chinese side yet, which means there could also be possibility that the 2 sides do not see yet. Those are the items as being mentioned by the other 2 American guests to be discussed. So Mr. Zhang, to you, how do you see March the 1st? how do you see the so-called deadline? How do you see the fact that when it's a negotiation, it's not just one side nodding the head to everything the other side said, but rather it is a discussion? Mr. Zhang.
My sense is that March 1st, actually, in fact, can make both two sides feel urgency a little bit in progress of negotiation. But the truly deadline, I think that will rely on if both sides can make consensus in negotiation. Also, especially that all of those fields, including 6 fields, are in negotiation. So my sense is that
those areas being mentioned in the Chinese media report after the last round, the 6th round of negotiation in Beijing, the 6 items you just said.
Yeah,
right?
So this time actually 7 rounds, including 6 fields, trading service, agricultural sectors, IPR, and subsidy issues, many of them. So everyone, for everyone, it's not easy to make consensus in short term. So I mean, all of those issues, some of them belong into short-term issues, but some of them belong into mid-term and long-term. So I think that this time, based on consensus made by 2 countries' leaders, maybe we can make, a very basic, fundamental, agreement. But the detail will rely on time.
Right, Professor Liu. I remember reading the statement in a way made in the Chinese official news agency, Xinhua News Agency, on the evening of the end of the 6th round last time in Beijing. And it was quoting the Chinese President Xi Jinping during a meeting in which Chinese President Xi Jinping met with the top negotiators, both the trade rep and also the Secretary Treasury, have been talking about China is negotiating with quote-unquote principles. So that is a very important phrase to bear in mind. Yes. Of course, in a negotiation, either of the 2 sides wants to push as much as possible. That's what negotiation is about. But on the other hand, the principles by 2 sides being held dear, also very important for any negotiation, Professor Liu.
Yeah, I think the principle is also the baseline that both sides will have to defend. From the China side, in the first place, it is really the China's legitimate right to develop itself, both in technology and economic prosperity. So that cannot be compromised. And the other is Chinese unique system. It's really institutional work. And given its long tradition from history, so that cannot be ordered because that's the treasure of the Chinese unique culture. And the other, as for the other one, is really both sides will have to negotiate for constructive results, not really to bring detriment to each other or to the rest of the world. So given these basic 3 principles, everything else can be really negotiated.
Let's talk about the long term, Mr. Moon. I know negotiators all want to rush for the short term, but it is really the long term that the 2 countries have to look at. But on the other hand, there are short-term timelines that both sides have to struggle with. For example, in the United States, Mr. Moon, you know politics than I do inside the Beltway. The presidential election 2020, the investigation going on inside the country, the 2 parties now in quite a tug of war toward one another. If you watch any TV program from both sides, you could see that very clearly. And you also see the uncertainty of the American economy, whether it is the stock market or it is the long-term prospect of the growth rate as a result of the stimulus over the past 2 years. So, Mr. Moon, how should we understand the domestic factors' impact on the possible direction of a middle and a long-term discussion between the 2 economies? Of course, from the U.S. perspective.
Well, I think it's important, especially for Chinese viewers, to understand that the American public feels differently about different issues.
Yeah.
And that there are a variety of issues where we are divided. But quite frankly, over the last few years, on these China economic issues, there is an overwhelming consensus. Both the Democratic and the Republican parties believe that there needs to be change. If there is any difference, it's over the methods we should use. There's some disagreement over whether tariffs are the best tool or not. But there is definitely a long-term consensus that there needs to be change. The relationship has become unequal and unfair, and I think there's really a broad consensus we need to do something. I also feel, my personal view is that we really do need to have a long-term negotiation. A short-term deal resolving everything would not be helpful. And the reason is that we have outstanding industrial policy issues that need to be resolved at the negotiating table. If they're not resolved at the negotiating table, then they will be resolved de facto through reciprocal and retaliatory events that will be very disruptive and very unhelpful to both sides. So I really want the negotiators to dig in and reach a preliminary understanding now and then get into these issues and resolve them once and for all over a little bit longer term.
Right. I understand, Mr. Moon, your point that there has been a consensus within the two political parties inside the United States about that they want to have what they consider as balance of trade with China, and also in the long term and short term. However, my question, sir, if you don't mind, may I just put it in a different way to clarify even clearer, that is whether the domestic chaotic situation, shall I say, or day-to-day crisis might influence the direction of the U.S. negotiation team and the direction of the U.S. negotiation demand, whether it is to one degree lesser or to the other degree stronger. It doesn't matter, that's what I meant. That's whether the domestic issues is going to really influence what is considered as the right approach toward China in a trade discussion. That's my question. Mr. Moon, your thought?
Yeah, I really don't think so. I really don't, the domestic factors that are out there could be politics, could be economics. As I said, from a political perspective, there's broad alignment. From an economic perspective, or if you're asking, is there some economic softness that's going to bring the U.S. to the table to provide easier terms? I don't think so. I think that that's wishful thinking, and President Trump engages in the same kind of wishful thinking on the Chinese side when he talks about weakness in the Chinese economy. These issues are very long-term, and serious people understand that they need to be given a lot of time and effort, and that a quarter's results or a certain weakness or statistics don't matter.
Okay, got your point. Let me go to you, Professor Liu, before I go to the other American guest. It is not rare that if you look at the media report these days, beside the trade discussions, there's another line of discussions going on about the real state of the American economy. The stock market over the past few months certainly have shown some dramatic colors. Meanwhile, you also see some of the industries inside the United States, beverages, for example, particularly some of, I wouldn't mention the company's name, but rather beverages companies that are global conglomerate based in the United States are having problems because the raw materials they are having the prices have been rising. And those are just one or two of those examples of which in a trade war, whoever is inside will have an impact anyway. Now, today is not the time that we debate who is having more impact, who is having less impact, because we just don't have the number, because neither side could really provide the number. So here's the thing. To your perspective, though, Professor Liu, how do you see the American situation as a Chinese observer likely to be impacted by the ongoing uncertainties in their countries as well? Politics, economics, stock markets for the short term, economic prospect for the longer term.
Well, on the consumer end, normally they don't right away to feel the pressure of the tariff, but after several months now they do because there is a time lag for dispersion of the cost at the customs. So given if there is another round of increased tariff, so consumers will definitely feel pinched by their pocket. And on the business circle, the impact is already being increasingly felt because they hold the money and they do not know how to place it, because business needs predictability, what is lying ahead, and they need to calculate the return on investment. Right. So, and also even international companies, particularly American companies that are parked in China, they do not know whether they're going to relocate to Vietnam or they want to continue to increase the investment here. So this sort of uncertainty is really a looming large for the global supply chain. Right. That is really hesitating.
Okay, so let me put that point also to Mr. Pruitt. Short term, it seems many, at least in the United States, need something to present to the market and say, see what we got. And the stock market don't become desperate, don't have this very devastating sentiment anymore. But the long term also requires that it is not a short discussion. So that's a very interesting thing, isn't it? You need to have something to present, and also something that you need to present and also could endure the critique. However, for the long term, the structural issues cannot be handled just within March the 1st or even April the 1st or even May the 1st. So how does that work? It's very interesting when I think about the mentality of the negotiators. Mr. Pruitt, you've been there.
Tian, when I was staff director of the Budget Committee, one of the statements that I made time and time again to the people working that process was, there you go, thinking logically again. In this instance, I think logic is not as clearly defined or narrowly defined as your question just suggested. I think the U.S. stock market really is looking for a level of predictability that at least runs for the next year, possibly two. Secondly, I would suggest that in terms of the structural things that need to be addressed here, some of the currency issues and other matters, those things I believe will ultimately not change very much. I think there are changes on the U.S. side that I'm sure the Chinese are pushing for that you haven't spoken about, mainly because we don't know what they are. At least that's not what's been presented in the media here. So I think if you look at this process in a total logical framework, you're going to misread what the ultimate outcome is, A. And then B, I think you need to understand that from the American side, President Trump really needs an agreement that gives some sense of stability to our economy and to our markets. And once he has that in hand, the other issues will continue to work themselves out, and I think be part of a longer-term discussion going forward.
Mr. Zhang, on the other hand, for China, past 40 years of reform and opening up proved one thing, that is for sure. Opening up helps the economy to become stronger and helps we to be where we are today, the second largest economy in the world. So no matter what is the temporary or in the future negotiation result, how is China looking at the commitment it should have for opening up?
Actually, opening up in the near future, in the long term, will be very critical for China's development. You know that even if China get very successful story of development, however, today China's domestic economic structure issues, development model issues, all of them actually formulated in progress of globalization and regional economic integration. In this sense, in the future, we have to be more open to get solutions for those problems. On the other hand, today, actually we are on age of globalization. Only by further opening up and then China could be more, energetic. Also, we can chase, innovation-oriented economic model because we need to attract, talents from global markets. Also, we need to stimulate innovation in global market.
Very interesting discussion, I have to say. I know that many of you have been dealing with this issue on a daily basis, probably on an hourly basis. So it's my great appreciation to all of you participating in this round of discussion. Thank you so much. Steve Pruitt, Jeff Moon, Zhang Jianping, Liu Baocheng. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. Welcome back. You're still watching World Inside with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. Every spring, the movie industry around the world gears up for its biggest celebration, the Academy Awards, more commonly known as the Oscars. The 91 Academy Awards ceremony honoring the best films of 2018 will be held on February the 24th. As a well-known screenwriter, director, and producer, Christopher McQuarrie got his start writing the script for The Usual Suspects in 1995, which won him the Best Original Screenplay Oscar. And he made his directorial debut in 2000 with The Way of the Gun. He's a frequent collaborator with Tom Cruise, having written and directed the Jack Reacher, Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, and Mission Impossible Fallout. Earlier, I had a chance to talk to him, and he shared his views on the American film industry and his personal stories, as well as how technology these days are transforming this industry. What is it like, Chris, to work with Tom Cruise and some of the other big names? What are the qualities you guys are looking for in each other?
Hard work, first of all. You really have to be willing to put in the extra hours to keep up with this team. These are always a challenge. They're always very fun, but it's always a lot of hard work. And you have to think on your feet because we're changing things all the time.
Wow, think on your feet. That is a great phrase I would love to adopt. You have to put extra hours. How many extra hours a day? What is your schedule like for a blockbuster like this?
You know, on a movie like this, when you're directing, it's really 24 hours a day. If you're awake, you're working. For some of the actors, it's difficult because they work so seldom, only because the schedule is very unusual. Yes. So in the case of someone like Vanessa Kirby, when Tom broke his ankle and it changed the schedule around, she worked 4 days over the course of a year. And so she thought she wasn't even in the movie.
But she is, and
yes.
She is brilliant in the movie, thanks to the efforts of the director.
I just point the camera. I'm very lucky. I have good people.
So humble. Having said that, though, you started as a screenplay writer. Yes. You won an Oscar even for that. Transition from screenplay writing to director, particularly for a blockbuster franchise like this. What is that qualities that you have to change about yourself and the ways you have to adjust?
That is a very good question.
You got your answers, I can tell.
Screenwriting is about taking everybody's vision and putting it into your work. You have the studio, you have the actors, you have the director, the producers. Everybody has ideas of what the movie should be, and you are trying to put all of that into what you do. Directing is taking everyone's work and putting it into your vision. You're bringing the actors together, the writer, the producer, the composer, all the designers, all the craftspeople that work behind it. So you couldn't have two more opposite skill sets. And to make the transition from one to the other, the first time you do it is very difficult.
But you know, when they say you got a big budget, when they say you got an A-list cast, right? And then they say you have so many special effects, does screenplay still matter?
Without story, it's all just spectacle. And it really ultimately comes down to character and an emotional connection to the characters.
But you know what? Some say those who are going to franchise movies, blockbuster movies like this, they're not necessarily looking for the most articulative stories. True. Do you agree with that?
I think well, in my experience, making movies like this, when you're making it for a mass audience and you go to these test screenings, different people want different things. And certain people just want all the action and none of the talking, and other people They want to break from all the action because they get exhausted. But all of them want story. So no matter how you express that, whether you do it through a lot of dialogue or you do it through a little, they want to feel some emotional connection to the story. Otherwise, they get bored.
But on the other hand, I mean, you've been writing for blockbusters. You've also been writing for indie films. I know you also got the heart for the indie films as well.
Very much so.
So how would you, direct your talents to two very different categories of stories that you have to craft? Will your talent be wasted for a blockbuster screenwriting? Well, for an indie film, you probably have to go all the way out as a screenwriter.
Well, it's to me, in terms of story, it's all the same. In terms of independent films
Sounds diplomatic.
Sounds
diplomatic.
Well, but here's the difference.
Okay.
With a blockbuster film, I have all sorts of resources that I don't have with an independent film. So where I don't have the helicopters and the cars and the, I have to rely more on story. I have to rely more on my actors to tell that story. And in the case of something like Mission Impossible, I have to rely more on the actors to do things like fly in the helicopters and drive the cars and do things like that. So it's really just a balance for me. It's if I have the resources to put all of the action in, I can do it. But where I don't, I just have to rely more on good old-fashioned story.
Are you already thinking about some indie films to be crafted in the near future?
I'm always thinking about that sort of thing. The trick is getting them made. Original movies are very, very tough to get made.
Why is it, you think?
It's simply the way the business has changed. Fewer and fewer people are going to see the movies, except in China. More and more people are going to see movies here in China. And the kind of movies that it takes so much to market a film and to get movies out there, that a smaller movie that nobody's ever heard of is just as hard, if not harder, to sell than a big movie with a recognizable name.
In recent years, the film industry has undergone major changes due to increased globalization and technology. Christopher McQuarrie interprets what these changes mean for future development of the industry. The world is changing.
Yes.
Chris, you know that much better probably than anybody else. And the industry is changing from the earlier studios to now to more internet-related companies, whether it's Amazon, Google, Netflix, and some of the others. What does this different roles that are coming into the scene mean to a screenwriter like you, for a movie director who is doing the content like you?
It doesn't change what I have to do. It just changes the way the movies are being watched. I think what you're seeing now is a generation of people going to movies who don't have an emotional connection with going to the cinema. They're not accustomed to going to see a movie where someone else says they have to go see it, when they have to see it. They're accustomed to watching movies they can watch it on their phone, they can watch it on a tablet, they can watch it on a
Anytime
computer.
at their argument.
Yes, whereas I grew up, and a lot of the people my age grew up, going to the movies was an event. It was a thing that you did. Young people now, they go to see movies in a theater because they have to. They go if it's a kind of movie where they need to be part of that conversation on Monday. They just have a different relationship with how they see movies, but they still respond to story.
Are there those stories changing, you think?
I think the basic elements of story still work. I mean, this movie is made with some of the most classic filmmaking styles and some of the most classic filmmaking tropes of stories that you've seen time and time again. When you do them right, they still work.
Technologies are also changing.
Without question.
AI, artificial intelligence, some have been using that to write screenplays. And some say it's successful, others say it's not. They've also been using robots now to act, like real act, not programmed kind of act.
Yes.
And likely even come into some competitions for award in a way. This is what's going on in the industry, whether you like it or not. So once again, what does it mean for, brilliant minds like you who've been really working on the craft, working on the content, working on the essence of stories? I hope you are still doing that.
Yes, absolutely. The day a computer can write a screenplay for me, I will be the first in line. Screenwriting is very, very hard.
Absolutely.
So
you told me about that last time. I remember so clearly.
It's difficult. It's much harder. I think it's harder than directing. It's probably not as physically demanding as directing, but it is. When you have to sit down and face the blank page, it's very, very tricky. But as for computers writing screenplays and robots starring in movies, I think it's far enough away that I won't have to worry about it in my lifetime. I hope.
But what is the most important and the most delicate about human relations and emotions that really trick us into watching all of these movies that you and your colleagues and many others have been producing? Will that be able to be reproduced by something else? But if reproduced for so many times in the same logic, will people be tired of it and once again looking for something new? That is really the question, isn't it?
Yeah, well, people are always looking for something new, but it's if you look at, take a movie like The Matrix. When The Matrix came out, that was a revolutionary movie.
Absolutely.
The Matrix was still using the same classic story of an orphan who did not know he was special. That is Harry Potter, Luke Skywalker, you name a franchise like that. We respond to that story and have responded to it not for hundreds but for thousands of years. I think for as long as people have been able to tell stories, that's the essence of it. It's wish fulfillment. We want to live inside of that movie. We want to live through other people's experiences. So I think that's one of the things that might keep actors safe and make it harder for a robot to take over the job. I don't know how many people are going to want to watch films and wish they were a robot.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't.
No. Unless it was a very good-looking robot.
Yeah, but it's very difficult for now.
Yes, exactly.
The technicians really work on that. Having said that, though, the industry is also changing in the other direction, policy-wise, for example. Justice Department right now is reviewing this so-called earlier case, 1948, so-called United States versus the Paramount Picture. It is about how the movie industry is being governed, being legislated from the very beginning of making the films all the way to the theaters. Of course, the players have changed. How actors and actresses work with the studios or the companies have changed. People watch, where do they watch the movies have changed. So these have to be changed according to the Justice Department. But of course, the reviewing process is still going on, as you may know. But the thing is, how will these policy changes, without being specific, also having an impact on how things work?
Not knowing enough about it, the only thing, you go and look at what was called the Hays Code. The Hays Code was a series of moral restrictions that were on film, which you couldn't show certain things, you couldn't say certain words, and they were at their time considered very, very strict. Some of the best films ever made were made during the Hays Code era because it forced creative people to find creative ways to express those things.
Give me an example or two.
Of movies that were made then. Casablanca was made during the Hays Code. A lot of the great film noirs were made during the Hays Code. And these were films that had lots to do with sex and violence and things that in those days you simply could not show, but dealt with a world that was much darker and more dangerous and more adult. And you realized you didn't need to show things explicitly in order to tell those stories. So for me, if you give me a limitation, I'm going to find a
great way to do it, and probably you're going to have fun in the process.
Yes, of course. I mean, to me personally, I like boundaries. They force me to be creative. Even a movie like Mission Impossible has enormous boundaries. There are things that we run into all the time that make the movie challenging, and we like those challenges.
Like what?
I have to make this movie, for example, it's got to be PG-13.
Yes, wow.
The audiences that I'm selling a movie to, younger audiences, they're at home watching Game of Thrones.
I know.
And Breaking Bad, and they're things that would be rated NC-17. You have to find ways to appeal to that audience and to attract them without without overstepping that boundary. I still
What
have to
what
make a
is the
movie for
trick
families.
then that you figured out?
The trick is, again, it all comes down to emotion, making a more emotional experience. The trick of making a movie, this is where I think a computer will have trouble, is figuring out this algorithm. You have to give the audience exactly what they expect in a way they never saw coming.
Having said that, though, Chinese movie making is picking up. But at the same time, you see some changes of the industry in the United States already. And the Chinese companies, particularly like Tencent, Alibaba, which is also included this time, I guess, with this movie, have been major players. But at the same time, the management of these companies and the way they do movies is still not necessarily as what we would expect from a long-time professional studios. So this is the thing, the new kids on the block, or the new masters on the block, how is it working out with the real, very professional people that have been in the industry for a long time? That's a very interesting chemistry that is going on here. What do you think, Chris?
I haven't noticed any sort of change.
Oh.
So for me, it's been business as usual. But I work in a very I'm in a very unusual situation. For the last 10 years of my career, I've been making movies with Tom.
That's right.
Most of the time, and Tom is given a lot of creative freedom. So really, the only person that I really have to have any conversations with is Tom.
Yeah.
And usually, we're working so quickly that nobody really knows what we're doing until the movie is finished.
I see.
Yeah.
That kind of bond is very important, isn't it? That
It's
trust,
very important.
that
Yeah, you have to
confidence in each other.
yes, and it's based on. It's interesting because people ask, do we ever argue about things? Do we ever have any conflicts? Tom will suggest things all the time that I don't understand, and I will suggest things to him that he does not understand. What we do is, rather than say, no, I don't want to do that, we'll say, okay, I'm going to try that. Because one of two things will happen. Either I will come to understand, or he will come to understand what the other one is after. Or the person who came up with the idea will recognize it doesn't work. Right. There's no pride of authorship. There's no ego attached to it, where because I came up with the idea and I insisted that we film it and spent money on it and it doesn't work, that doesn't mean I'm going to insist that it works. We very quickly recognize when something works or it doesn't, and we let it go, and we learn from that experience and move on. So it's a very conflict-free relationship.
It's amazing you could always look for and find inspirations in one another after even 10 years of working together. That is amazing. I guess both of you have very good learning spirit. Lifelong learning is...
You have hit the nail on the head. We don't come to anything certain that we know what the process is. Quite the opposite. We know that as much as we think we know, we don't know anything.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.